how Afro hair went from natural beauty to a sign of resistance. Ever wonder why older African generations get a bit triggered when they see a black boy or black man growing his afro out? In this video, I'll be discussing the history of Afro hair in sub-Saharan Africa and how it has affected beauty standards within the Black African community. Since this is a complex topic with deep history, I've tried to keep it a bit short but detailed. Otherwise, this would have ended up being a 1-hour video. Quick disclaimer, as a Christian myself, this is not a video bashing religion. This is a video discussing the mistakes of people who took advantage of religion and misused it for their own ideals. In this video, I will explore how Afro hair dysmorphia came to be in sub-Saharan Africa and how it is linked to Eurocentric Christian ideals. Because believe it or not, at some points in history, even African hairstyles were deemed inappropriate and evil. I won't be able to cover everything, so if necessary, there will be a part 2. But let's get into it. It wasn't too long ago that many Black African people associated traditional African hairstyles with witches or Afro hair with village girls. But why? Because for a long time, Afro hair and traditional African hairstyles were tied to African beliefs and therefore seen as not in line with Eurocentric Christian standards. Contrary to what many believe, the start of Afro dysmorphia began in Africa due to slavery and colonialism. But how? Well, through Christianity. Yes, Christianity. Some of you might be wondering what Christianity has to do with hair, or how there could even be a correlation. Others may point to the common argument that Christianity existed in Africa before Europeans came. Christianity was already present in northern Africa, the Horn of Africa, and even northern regions of Congo. In other words, Christianity existed in all the regions and countries mentioned in the Bible long before it arrived in Europe. That being said, that accounts for maybe a handful of ethnicities. The millions of other tribes and ethnicities that existed in sub-Saharan Africa back then had their own faiths, spiritualities, and beliefs, some even believing in multiple gods. They believed in gods and deities that looked like them. So, what people often fail to realize when they say Christianity existed in Africa before colonization is that the Christianity, or at least the teachings, brought by missionaries to West Africa in the 15th century and later to South and Central Africa, was in no way, shape, or form the same as that practiced in places like Ethiopia. Because while Ethiopians believed in biblical figures who looked like them, West Africans were being forced to believe in biblical figures who all looked European, slowly being conditioned generation after generation to associate good with European and bad with African. And so, the message missionaries spread wasn't just that Jesus was good. The main message was that Jesus was pale, with blue eyes and straight ash blonde hair. Just for context, this started before the transatlantic slave trade and before Christopher Columbus even landed in the Americas. Hair policing was not only used to force Eurocentric ideals onto communities, but also as a form of punishment, stripping people of their identities. Before sending enslaved people onto ships, the first thing that was done, alongside other forms of punishment, was to shave the hair of men and women, because of what hair meant in those communities. Hair was spiritual, and hairstyles were used to showcase a person's tribal origin as well as their status in society. But what does this have to do with Christianity? Well, during the conquest to convert black West Africans along the coast during the colonial era, missionaries built Christian schools to convert children and families. These schools eventually became mandatory, and the first rule set in place in those schools was for both boys and girls to have shaved heads always. Meanwhile, grown black women were only allowed to either have short shaved hair or to cover their hair with cloth to hide their texture and African hairstyles, which were deemed uncivilized and unfit for Christian standards at the time. While these practices became mandatory in most of coastal West Africa, starting in the 15th century, they spread to much of Central and Southern Africa by the 17th century. The rules set by these missionary schools eventually became a mandate for all schools even after independence. To this day, multiple countries and communities are still fighting for this rule to no longer exist at any school. To this day, you will still find schools throughout sub-Saharan Africa that ban girls and boys from growing out their Afro hair. The end result: lost hair knowledge. Generations have grown detached from their Afro hair and have lost the knowledge of how to care for and grow it, because for at least 20 generations, rules and laws were set in place that didn't allow them to even get to know their natural hair at a young age, let alone be allowed to grow it out freely and wear it freely. And so, from the trading era with the Portuguese in the 15th century, to the colonial era, and all the way to today, big Afro hair, worn out in the open, was seen as a sign of resistance. The idea that began 500 years ago and has been reinforced ever since, even by black Africans themselves due to years of conditioning, is that the more Eurocentric a hairstyle, the more modest, luxurious, elegant, civilized, and classy a person is. And so, if a woman couldn't change her hair texture, she would cover it up with a cloth instead. People continued doing authentic African hairstyles, but they were no longer used to show status or tribal identity. They were simply a way to manage Afro hair while it was tucked away or hidden. After 500 years of forced conditioning, communities truly started associating anything Afro with ugliness, poverty, or being unkempt. Certain African hairstyles became associated with poverty, or, in extreme cases, even with witchcraft. All because they were tied to non-Eurocentric beliefs. As I mentioned before, still to this day, many schools across sub-Saharan Africa force boys and girls to keep short hair until university. Many professions still associate Afro hair and African hairstyles without extensions as unprofessional, ugly, or unkempt, all for not fitting ideals that were put in place by missionaries several generations ago. But you know, who was never hit by this Afro hair dysmorphia or hair policing? Do you know which communities have women with strong, healthy, big, long, kinky Afro hair? Strict, isolated tribal communities in the Western Sahel. For those who don't know, the Western Sahel is the massive land area under northwestern Africa. And you know what they all have in common? Former massive Muslim empires. Yes, believe it or not, during the colonial era, the French and British had a hands-off policy for black African communities that were part of these big former Muslim empires. Why? Because those communities were harder to break down due to the fact that they had multiple allies and were all united under one faith. This hands-off policy meant no forced conversion to Christianity, meaning no missionary schools, and as a result, no hair policing of black African kids. Most importantly, These communities were never forced to cover or hide away their hair with the sole purpose of hiding or hating their Afro hair texture. This hands-off policy meant that these communities never lost their hair knowledge or grooming techniques. So even if you look at the most isolated communities in those regions today, you'll notice how their hair culture focuses not on hiding or changing the texture, but on keeping Afro hair healthy and strong. These communities don't have to relearn how to care for their hair textures because they never forgot in the first place. And they also don't obsess over other people's hair textures because generations of people were allowed to pass on their hair knowledge, love, and secrets, making it easier for them to care for their texture. Don't believe me? Just look at the most isolated communities in countries like Niger or Chad. Now, some of you might wonder why Eurocentric teachings still matter throughout most of Christian sub-Saharan Africa, since these countries are now independent and free. Well, to put it short and not so sweet, what was learned and forced for 500 years will not be undone in just 70 years. It will take a lot of work to undo the teachings, ideals, and standards that have been passed down for over 20 generations. But it is up to us. It is up to us, and nobody else, to learn from scratch. It is up to us, and nobody else, to teach girls and boys to love their kinky texture. It is up to us to quit the obsession with other people's hair textures. It is up to us to become experts on our own hair texture before becoming experts on others. It is very much up to us to be aware of how we think and why we think it, and to make the deliberate choice to make a difference and be selective about the beauty ideals we choose to reinforce and when. Because when you see multiple viral glow-up videos go from neglected afro or cornrows to Indian hair, you know there is a message being sent loudly by the same people who are affected by those ideals. And who is getting the message? Kids, young girls. Because no, Afro hair isn't unmanageable, it isn't unprofessional, and it isn't a curse. As I've said in previous videos, most people know more about how to care for straight, wavy, or loosely curled hair, which is why those textures seem easier to manage and are labeled good hair. My hope is that more people become aware of the history of Afro hair dysmorphia so that they can understand just how deep and intentional it is in order to make the necessary changes. Anyway, if you need the push and motivation to start loving and embracing your gorgeous Afro hair, then be sure to check out my other videos.